To mark the 200th anniversary of the founding of the town of Greece, the Greece Historical Society presents a Bicentennial Snapshot. Each week we take a look at a particular aspect of Greece history. Today we will talk about how past epidemics and pandemics affected the town of Greece. Here's a graphic we've become familiar with. Since March 2020, we have been living with the COVID-19 virus. During the pandemic of the last 3 years, we have had to make numerous adjustments to mitigate the impact of this deadly virus. In the early days, masks became obligatory. Government offices, schools, and businesses had to shut down. And we found different ways to meet. Tens of thousands of people were stricken with the disease. Our hospitals and other medical facilities were overwhelmed. Too often, family members could not be with their loved ones. Sadly, presently, more than 1,900 people in Monroe County have died. Throughout its history, the people of Greece have had to endure other deadly diseases. You may recall seeing this drawing in an earlier snapshot. But we want to again point out how swampy the shoreline of the Genesee River was, not only at the mouth of the river, but along much of its length in the 9 miles upriver to Rochesterville, a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. An octogenarian wrote in 1868, "This country was sickly, as all new lands are, particularly at the mouth of the river, where 2 or 3 sets of inhabitants died off. And indeed the whole country was infected with agues and fevers." It wiped out the early settlement of King's Landing, which we told you about in Snapshot 4.
To learn more about King's Landing, click here in the upper right.
The early settlers called it Genesee fever. It was a relentless cycle of fever and chills that plagued them during the warmer months. The cold and snowy months brought them some relief. People blamed it on a miasma. That is, a noxious vapor rising from marshes or decomposing matter that infected and poisoned the air. They did not realize that the mosquitoes which thrived in the swampy waters of the riverbanks was the cause. One historian says that about 20 graves were made in 1798 at King's Landing for people who had succumbed to the Genesee fever. One of them was Gideon King, founder of the settlement. After his widow died in 1830, a tombstone was erected on her husband's grave. It was inscribed with these words: "The Genesee fever was mortal to most heads of families in 1798 and prevented further settlements till about 1815. It was a half a century before medical professionals diagnosed Genesee fever as malaria. Another deadly illness ascribed to miasma was cholera. Greece settlers were affected by 2 epidemics, one in 1832 and one in 1852. Much like the COVID virus was introduced to this country by travelers, so too was cholera. According to Letters on Yellow Fever, Cholera, and Quarantine, addressed to the legislature of the state of New York with additions and notes from 1852, cholera originated in India. In the early 1800s, it started to spread out of Asia, eventually making its way to North America in 1832. It arrived on the continent in Quebec and Montreal, brought by immigrant ships. It then made its way to New York State. Cholera officially reached Rochester on July 12, 1832. Cholera is caused by contaminated water and food. A toxigenic bacterium infected the small intestine, triggering an acute diarrhea illness. Sanitation was extremely poor, sewer systems non-existent, and people did not connect the disease to polluted water, but to miasma. Most of the cholera victims lived close to the Genesee River or the Erie Canal, into which raw sewage was dumped. Public wells became contaminated, as did private wells, as they were very often located close to outdoor privies. Cholera was also called the Blue Death. The severe dehydration caused by the diarrhea turned a victim's skin blue. The seemingly vigorous in the morning were carried to their graves before night, wrote Jenny Marsh Parker in 1884. In 1832, the cholera epidemic broke out in Rochester and the surrounding towns. In just 6 short weeks, the epidemic took almost 2,500 lives, or 1% of the population of the area. During the months of July and August, business and travel were almost entirely suspended. Giles Holden, head of the Board of Health centered in Charlotte, closed the port and posted guards on Ridge Road to keep infected parties out of Greece. One reference said that the people who succumbed to the cholera in 1832 epidemic were buried in unmarked graves in the northwest corner of the Charlotte Cemetery, in the area surrounding Sam Patch's grave. There were a series of deadly outbreaks of cholera in the mid-1850s, 1852, 1854, and 1856. In 1854, one of the victims was Belinda Holden Marshall, married to ship's captain Stephen Marshall and sister of Giles Holden. In September of 1856, 12 immigrants sick with cholera were left at Charlotte. Henry Spencer, the poor master, had them taken in a wagon to a building near the pier so they would be isolated from the villagers. Some of them were children who were so delighted with the ride to the lake that they shouted and waved their hands. They all died the next day. They too are buried in the Charlotte Cemetery, also in unmarked graves. But the hardest hit area was Patty Hill. A newspaper article in 1879 said about the 1852-54 epidemic. The writer of this can go back in memory to the great cholera plague of over a quarter of a century ago, which rendered this city desolate and populated its graveyards. The surrounding towns were free from the visitation of this destroyer, except the town of Greece, immediately about Mount Reed, predominantly south of our Mother of Sorrows church. There the cholera held fatal revel for many days and swept away to eternity members of the best families in the locality. There was a terror everywhere around, and the little graveyard that caps the hill witnessed more corpses at a time to the burial than there were mourners able to be present. In the ensuing years, the residents of Patty Hill, predominantly south of our Mother of Sorrows church, were particularly susceptible to dysentery as well as cholera and had a high rate of fatalities, as the headline states. Medical professionals concluded that well water was being contaminated from runoff from the cemetery. There are many parallels between the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, measures to prevent the spread of the flu were the same later recommended for COVID. Where ships and boats were agents spreading the cholera contagion in the 19th century, trains were the agent of the 20th and would give way to airplanes in the 21st century. Most of the documentation for the Spanish flu in Monroe County is about the city of Rochester, but one can still get a sense of its impact on Greece. There were 3 deadly waves of the flu between the spring of 1918 and the spring of 1919. Rochester was most seriously affected by the fall 1918 wave. In the 2 months between the middle of September and the middle of November, more than 10,000 people caught the flu, and 1,000 of them died. But health authorities acted quickly to contain the spread. 2 weeks after the first cases occurred, they closed schools, theaters, churches, sports venues, hotel bars, and other places where people gathered. Troop transports facilitated the spread of the flu, and infections at military posts were high. That was the case in Greece. At the time of the Spanish flu, Kodak Park was still a part of the town. There was an aerial photography school posted there. 57 men from the school came down with the flu. So the old infant summer hospital on Beach Avenue was reopened to care for them. The towns around Rochester fared much better than the city. The number of infections was manageable. Nevertheless, school nurses from the city visited homes in Greece. One nurse, Rose Weber, visited a family of 8 in Greece, and every single member of the family was infected. The youngest child was little more than an infant. Quote, "No one was dying, but every person was in need of care. Miss Weber saw that the family was made as comfortable as possible. A doctor interested himself and toward midnight went to the home with a woman who had consented to care for the family." End quote. Thanks for joining us this week. Next week, we will look at those diseases that greatly impacted children. This is Maureen Whalen, inviting you to join us next Tuesday for another Bicentennial Snapshot, presented by the Greece Historical Society.
Want to learn more from the Greece Historical Society and Museum? Then click that subscribe button for more content and hit that bell icon to get notified when there's more Bicentennial Snapshots. You can visit us on the web at greecehistoricalsociety.org. You can find us on Facebook at Greece Historical Society, and you can stop in at the Greece Historical Society at 595 Long Pond Road.